Yes, here.
Hi, thanks everybody. My name is Mazen Ijbai. I'm from Help for Syria, UK. I have a question almost for everybody, but I'm going to start with Mr. Hamza. Could you please elaborate a little bit more about the module that you said that sometimes international organizations follow, and in a way you said that they found out that it cannot be implemented everywhere in every country where there is a crisis into it. Is that just finding, or there is recommendations into how to tackle that? Is there any mechanism put in place into how to relax the rules sometimes from one country to another? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Looking around. Any hands? Yes, this lady here, second row.
Thank you. My name's Serena Brown from KPMG. Thank you all very much for your interesting presentations. I find the Red Cross generally is quite sophisticated in its approach to private sector engagement, but I don't think that comes through strongly in this report. And although there's mention of new actors like the private sector, I think it would be good to give that much more consideration. If you look at the table, figure 4.6 on page 107, the amount of financing that's come from different sources, KPMG and many other companies would actually feature on that table. But I know there are challenges in that it's not centrally reported. But I think the significance of the shift in financing, but also a lot could be learnt from the way that private sector engages with local actors. So although you might think of a multinational company as being headquartered in the UK and the US, it's actually our local company that is responding and already has those local civil society relationships. So that's the key point that I would like to make. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And let's take one more in this round.
Brendan Paddy from the Disasters Emergency Committee. I wanted to ask, can donors, individual donors in the West, support local NGOs rather than Western NGOs, and should they?
Okay, thank you very much. Let's take one more, Tanya, over here. This lady in the red, sorry, Veronique, yeah.
Hi, I'm Sophia from Sindh, Oxford Brookes University. For a long time, I mean, I completely agree with the idea of working with local actors. And also, generally, even in the developmental discourse, I mean, we've been talking about local communities. I mean, it's in a way as local actors. But over a period of time, there has also been critique of the idea of community, the disaggregated, the fact that community in itself has many, whether it's ethnicity or gender or many other issues. Are a part of that, and so community in itself is not really a neutral term. And similarly, when you talk about local actors, how do you see this playing out? Because for somebody like me, humanitarian effectiveness is not a very, if you talk about effectiveness, it's not just a very neutral word. Yeah, it speaks to different people, even within locations. It can be, the gender issues, the maybe different minority issues and all that. So how do you see this complexity really playing out when you say that local actors are the key to humanitarian effectiveness?
Thank you very much.
What does your report say about that?
Okay, thank you. We'll do this round, and then we'll have another round of questions. I'm going to start with Mo, since some of them are directed to you specifically.
Should we kind of divvy them up between us?
Sure, yeah.
So I'll respond to the first one. Without sort of having to describe the model, the system is structured for a reason. Donor money is taxpayers' money, so accountability is at a premium here. The tools and methods used to ascertain the legitimacy and to vet, if you like, local NGOs, right, may be applicable in peacetime. They're very difficult to apply, and they've proven actually, and Rana could kind of back me up on this. How do you do this for an organization that did not exist before the conflict? You had a proliferation of organizations in Syria that kind of sprung up, a kind of well-meaning, helpful people, Syrian doctors, for example, that just did not exist before the conflict. And then you have a set of rules that says you have to submit your organizational model, your accounts, your turnover for the last 5 years. You were not there, sort of 5 years before, right? So that's just one part of it. So it's not. You also have very stringent and strict requirements of tracking where the funding goes. So anti-terror laws, for example, that requires that. Money laundering, corruption, everything that goes into this, right? But you have organizations that either very new, do not have the capacity to back this up, cannot present that evidence, for example, right? Sometimes you also have duplication in the system, and we found that in parts of Afghanistan, the same organization was assessed about 15 times, almost by the same sort of system for different projects. And ironically, some of those who were doing the assessment were organizations that were actually competing for funding with that very same organization. So there is something not, see, that's where the mismatch, and that's where it doesn't fit. And the argument here is that we need to be flexible enough. We need to think different models that adapts and allows for a protracted conflict or a no-access context is very different from when you can have sort of face-to-face engagement and partnership with this, right? And that's exactly what Abdurrahman sort of reflected on. The issue of trust is very important, and we focus a lot on sort of the international side trusting the local side. But there is an equal mistrust on the other side. When you've been assessed, when you're an organization at the forefront and dealing with the day-to-day reality, and you feel that you're not trusted by your donors, yeah? So that's where the mismatch is between a system that was set up for a context is not applicable for a new context, and we have to think that very quickly. Well, the solution is to rely more on the credible organizations that already exist in that locality, right? And not trying to, so a third party, for example, right?
But if you can't reach these organizations because they are in an area which is government controlled, like in Syria, you cannot reach them.
Yeah. But there isn't, I don't have a ready answer for this, right? This is something that has kind of hit the system very recently. So there aren't any quick sort of fixes to that. Okay? And what the report is actually arguing for is that we need to engage those local actors first, the ones that you trust actually first, in figuring out what these solutions are, because they're going to be very different in Syria from Somalia, for example. That reality, that contextual, operational reality is very different even between. So, and I go back to kind of Joe's point, that we need to allow for these sort of homegrown solutions, because there is a humanitarian ecosystem, but there is also sort of sub-ecosystems within each one of them. The models are going to be different, the solutions are going to be different between Somalia, Afghanistan, the Central African Republic, for example. The reality and the dynamics of the conflict determines the set of actors. So one of the things that came out very strongly in that report is we, as in the international community, we intervene in a context that we're trying to influence, but we're also influenced by it. And that's where we need to change. That's where we need to adapt to that changing context, rather than sort of standing still and being fixed and rigid and expecting that we would change and influence that context. But we also need to do that in different locations in different ways. And I've been in this business for about sort of 30 years, and that search for the holy grail, the applicable model to everywhere and all times, and we need to move away from that. Guidance, policy guidance, yeah, that's important. But we need to allow that local context to emerge its own, or to grow its own models and its own solution.
Well, thanks. Now, who'd like to go next? Abdurrahman.
You know, it's not always negative. There are lots of positive models and examples. In Somalia, one of the greatest examples of a local organization that came out from nowhere, a lady establishing it in 1991, called Whole Relief, started to get support from Oxfam, being built capacities and so on, and now is one of the most influential, now it's called itself international NGOs, not just working in Somalia, but also Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, and South Sudan, better known as ADESO. And that's the experience of Oxfam building it, supporting it, and the organization getting and growing on its own. It has a lot to do with leadership as well. But I just want to answer the question from Brendan on can individual donors support local NGOs in the West, from the West, sorry. And I say my answer to this is why not? Because if you look at it, if local NGOs have to compete with international NGOs for funding, they will never win. And I think there are calls now, when we're talking about localization of aid and so on, to create specific pool funds for local NGOs that would also include capacity building element.
Thanks very much. Rana?
I'd just like to build a little bit on what Mo said from what's actually happening on the ground. One additional factor in Syria is that civil society is sanctioned, so they cannot open bank accounts. So that's another factor that makes the picture more complicated, and I think you know that. But but Alex said something that's very important about how having built the capacities of national Red Crescent societies was very useful in peaceful times than in now during the conflict. And this too is true for civil society. It was the NGOs that were working with civil society individuals before the conflicts that have been able to build this trust during conflict, and these were able to build those kind of sustained relationships. And these are the civil society movements that were able to expand and with more effectiveness during the conflict. But another factor the report built on a little bit was the diaspora groups, because and that network and that mobile kind of interaction. And again, I have no solutions. I'm sorry for that. Can they support local NGOs rather than Western NGOs? Well, this is happening already, actually. So, so again, it's proven it can work. But again, like mind the complexities about the sanctions. A lot of what's happening too is a lot of them sometimes partner, and it grows through the funds of another NGO to get into the local one. So this happens too. The community is not neutral. This is, of course, the issue of accountability, transparency, and I think it ends up to this, the last statement in the report of focus on people, focus on their human rights. And maybe, and I was thinking about this, one agency cannot really, is not seen neutral, even within the international community, no matter how much its values are building on this. But again, the perceptions of the locals to it are different. So again, if we look at this, maybe certain actors could work together differently in some areas. I think that whereas, for instance, the Red Crescent is more active in certain areas in Syria, the MSF are a lot more active in other areas. So it's again about this combined efforts and creativity in managing the system.
Thanks, Rana. Alexander, and we've got an interesting question about the private sector. I don't know if someone wants to address that.
Well, I think it's a fair point that there's more than we realise that is going on. And I mentioned Kenya in the small remarks I made. They did actually raise $10 million for their last round independently within Kenya from the private sector. So, and I'm not sure where, if or how that was ever recorded. So it's clearly going on. But I think there's a lot of work to be done about how the private sector can partner well with the humanitarian sector. And for I mean, my personal perspective would need to be around that investment approach, looking at context, long-term, looking at the institutions, and looking at some of the skill sets that you could impart that humanitarian organisations require. And more of that and less of the small project money. But I know that's a dialogue that is ongoing. But on the sort of also interesting issue about the sort of incompatibility between effectiveness, as in, and within our sector, that often means how easy it is to manage grants, which means choosing less organisation, and complexity and diversity. There is an incompatibility there. I mean, I don't know if the DEC really could support lots of local organisations unless you're willing to increase the size of your secretariat by 10 times to manage so many grants. So, you know, we are stuck in that dilemma at the moment, which is having a big impact on I think, how the sector is working. I think we all need to be challenged to work with national partners better. But whether you can create that diversity here in the UK, for example, and not have giant secretariats that manage it, I'm not sure.
Thank you. Joe?
I might just focus on this last question, this question around more direct support. So I think Mo's kind of summarised very well, if you like, the kind of quite fundamental challenge that we have in terms of admin and accountability, and I won't rehearse those arguments because they're familiar. I think there are other reasons why we need to be careful about how much we wish for in terms of direct donor support to lots and lots and lots of different NGOs. And the reason why I say that is because I'm not sure that sitting in London or even in Nairobi, DFID, with a relatively small number of people, is the best organisation to talk, is best placed to be deciding who has got the best delivery capacity in very remote areas. And I'm not sure that you want us to be making those decisions. So I think it's probably important that we think about, when we're thinking about financing, that we're distinguishing between two related but distinct things. One is, how could donors be investing more strategically in the capacity of civil society, but also of local government and of national government? And I think that's one series of answers about, if you like, strategic investment and capacity building, as opposed to the direct support for delivery in particular contexts, where I suspect that some kind of wholesaling and mediation is important, not only to manage the due diligence arguments, but also to make sure that resources are going where they're most needed. So I think we need to distinguish between those two problems. And again, that's what I was saying in terms of thinking about ahead to Istanbul, what could an offer look like on this? And Abdul Rahman has kind of identified one that I think is on the table around how could you have a group of NGOs coming together so that there's kind of an ability to wholesale support for national NGOs and to manage the due diligence in a slightly different way. And I guess the kind of core principle that I think we could be looking at in terms of that type of proposal would be increased transparency, really, in terms of the relative costs as money is passing through the system. So I think we would recognise there is a legitimate cost that international NGOs and the UN are facing as they pass money down through the system. I think what we just want to be able to be is a bit more explicit about those costs and what's the value that we're getting out of it. Thanks.
Can I just add, I'll just add one, sort of, there is an example, and just that bridges your question and Supriya's question about effectiveness. If you move away sort of from conflict as a context, and if you look at Bangladesh, for example, and this is a Red Cross example here, 1970s, cyclone fatalities, 300,000, 500,000 in one event, yeah? Cyclone Sidr, how many? About 2,800, 3,000? Right, going back to what Jode mentioned, some things take a generation for it to happen. That actually took 30 years, more than 30 years. But 30 years in investment, in consistent investment, is one of the best cyclone warning and evacuation systems that we know of. But it took that commitment for long, and it involves, it's very localized, and it relies heavily, it's custom tailored, designed for it, emerged actually from those local communities on a very micro scale, and it acknowledged sort of issues of sort of gender, culture, effectiveness, efficiency, all of that stuff, and it was allowed to do that by this sort of kind of long-term commitment. So while there is a need, yes, I agree with you totally, there is a need for some immediate action on certain issues, but some of these problems, it doesn't matter how much money you throw at it, it doesn't matter. What matters is the long-term commitment to it, and you build it from the ground up. And that's one of the sort of the examples that nobody kind of hears about a lot. Right?
Very important point. Let's take another round of questions. I'm going to start with one from our online audience, and then I'll call on some of you. Let me see if I can read this extremely small writing. David Jones, who's the CEO of Rescue Global, wants to ask Mo, with regard to international NGOs and charities and the movement towards empowering local and national actors, what ramifications would that have on the business model and funding streams of these organizations? And secondly, what is Mo's view on a more holistic ecosystem with regard to development and response, including the private sector, which was specifically mentioned as being of great importance in the future of the APEC Senior Disaster Managers Conference in Manila a few weeks ago. Did you get all of that? I can repeat that in a minute. Let's go on. There's another online question here. This is from General Romeo Pauquiz, who's the former commander of the 2nd Division for the Philippines, Air Force Philippines, and he'd like to ask the panel, having lived through the international response to Super Typhoon Yolanda, or Haiyan, a year later when the Philippines faced another storm of great potential, Hagupit, or I think it was Ruby, the English version, the Philippines requested that there be no large-scale international response this time, and that any response be coordinated through the Department of Foreign Affairs and the appropriate national channels. I believe that this represents a change in the attitudes of national disaster management agencies, potentially far wider than the Philippines. Perhaps this is a reaction to the impact that Level 3 responses, which necessarily do not seek to empower local and national actors. What is your view? How should this change? So that's quite an interesting and challenging question for us. So we have those two. Let's take a couple from the audience, and I want to get someone from over here.
Hi, it's Saoirse from the British Red Cross. The conversation so far has been very much focused on civil society, NGOs, and national societies. And I think a large part of this discussion, and the report touches upon it as well, is supporting and encouraging the leadership of national government. And I'm wondering, could the panel reflect on that, and how in a international system, an international humanitarian system that is largely state avoiding, what change do we want to make to ensure that national governments is also part of this new narrative?
Okay, thank you. A question related to the generals. Let's take this person over here.
Thank you. It's Abdi from Global Somali Diaspora. And well, first of all, I welcome the report. I mean, we have a long way to go, but at least we're asking the right questions, so that's to be welcome. And obviously, as we embrace this localized agenda or approach, one of the questions we should ask is, how do we utilize diaspora? How do we utilize diaspora? And I wonder if there are any examples of good practice of where diaspora, local actors, and international donors work together. So thank you.
Okay, and then just here.
Erica Hoganson from Crown Agents. I'm curious what the impact regional actors might have on access to local partners and local actors, and then also the buy-in this idea is coming from if we've got the Chinese government also as they are increasingly involved in humanitarian responses, what the Chinese perspective is on this.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll start with those. I don't know if we'll have another round for questions, but please see if you can grab the panelists afterwards if we don't. Let's see. Shall we start? Let's start with in a different order this time, maybe with Alexander.
Sure. There's quite a few questions there.
Yes, I mean, you don't have to answer all of them. You choose the ones that... Mo says you have to answer all of them, actually.
Okay. Well, let's talk. I mean, there's a couple of references to sort of more assertive governments or how to work with governments. I mean, I just throw one idea out there. Having sort of sat on many interagency working groups and also had an opportunity to sit on a Global Fund country coordinating mechanism, the country coordinating mechanism being much more government-led, the latter, the interagency group being, well, international interagency-led. The CCM struck me as a far better model, actually, in terms of real coordination and government ownership. It still had international actors around the table, but they had to fit into a plan that was coordinated and owned by the national government and by national NGOs. And I think there are models out there in the sort of development health side of the sector that we can learn from on the humanitarian side that will start advancing this agenda of more national ownership. And interestingly, just on this question about sort of regional governments as well and support to governments, I did have an opportunity as part of the World Humanitarian Summit preparations to chair in Southern Africa 3 working groups on the issue of the future of the sector with exactly the same questions, one with governments, one with international organizations, and one with affected communities. And there were 3 entirely different discussions. They were not the same perspectives coming out at all. And the international agencies talked a lot about coordination, longer-term funding mechanisms, but for the government it was all about how do you influence budgetary support, how do you influence budgets in country, how do you activate your regional economic communities to be more useful and to promote more learning, and almost no reference actually to international assistance. So there are, I think it's a good question, there are parallel discussions going on. It's very important those discussions are helpfully joined up.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Joe next. I think we're going to you last, Mo. You'll have the last word.
Oh, no.
So I might just sort of follow up on just sort of focusing on the government issue a bit. And I think where we're heading towards is a much more sort of differentiated discussion. I think we need to be quite smart here about distinguishing between the Philippines type contacts where you've got a government that has a lot of capability, resources, recognised internationally, able to use a whole range of instruments, including access to World Bank finance, for example, in order to address the aftermath of these big crises. And we need to be able to distinguish those contexts from working in Aleppo, which are clearly, but we're pretending that we basically have the same set of instruments, and this is crazy. So I think where we want to be, over the next few years, is being able to have a much smarter sense about when one does want to be not just working alongside government, but be part of a government-led response, and where that is much more problematic. And so I think we're beginning to get in that place, and I think the Philippines kind of exemplifies that approach. I think too that in terms of the question about where's China, well, I think it would be really interesting to hear from them on precisely this point. And I think probably what we are likely to need to explore is this kind of also the trade-off between, again, this idea of sort of localization being one agenda, it isn't. So there's the issue about national governments and their sovereignty, and then there's their relationship with municipal authorities on the one hand and with civil society on the other. And so I think those relationships will not always be straightforward. And I think next week we'll have a very interesting series of discussions in Geneva where those kind of trade-offs and tensions will be explored, I think, by a wide range of people. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Rana, anything that you would like to?
I'll just build a little bit on the question on the impact of the regional actors on the local actors, and I'll specify the case for Syria. I think it's very unfair to homogenize local international actors into one side, just as it is unfair to homogenize local actors. And even I think it's very difficult to assess the impact, but I can talk a little bit about the positives that we're seeing with the Syrian case and the negatives. So just to start with the negatives, to build on with the positives later on. And I spoke a little bit about this projectization of civil society. I meant by it this very big definition. So it does include other local actors too. So we see how the projects are changed just as per the needs of the internationals, not the locals. We see what the locals call the corruption of civil society because of a lot of funding. So a lot of small groups cannot handle it.
Don't touch it. Yeah.
Sorry for those.
No, sorry to interrupt. Carry on.
So a lot of small groups, small movements cannot handle the big amounts of money. So a lot of corruption is happening in the process. And you spoke about what's happening in Somalia. A similar thing is happening to Syria, where Gaziantep is the hub of all those international NGOs and implementers. And that's the privatization of support to Syria. And again, private actors are mostly interested in delivering their projects. So they're really not very interested on the impact on the locals as much as it is on the checklist. But part of the positives is those advocacy platforms, this better engagement of the diaspora. Again, the capacity building, the funds, even though the capacity building needs to move beyond, introduction into X or Y or Z, and to serve mostly those functional needs of the local actors rather than the technicals. That's just to draw a little bit on that. Thank you
very much. Abdurrahman.
I just wanted to highlight, if we talk about the impact of regional actors in Somalia, you're going to talk about 50 years of history of international interference of all sorts and so on from regional actors in the local dynamics. And I think it's challenging because each actor is different from one another and there are different levels of structures and so on. And it's not, a win-win situation. And you don't know where it wants to go. But I think that whoever is involved in this situation, and in this context, there needs to be a dialogue with them. And that's the challenge that many of the organizations face in the context of Somalia, not just with regional dialogues with the regional actors, but also local actors. And just to explain, we have now there is now in Somalia a federal system, different regional states that do not necessarily coordinate with each other, but NGOs and local actors are required to register in 6 different states and pay a fee of $1,000 for international NGOs and $500 for local NGOs. And because you have to negotiate access and dealings and so on with the authorities, you also have to negotiate with 6 different states. So that part is not very, very easy to deal with and can be time consuming, but that's what umbrella groups and consortia are there for. But I think also to comment on the issue of supporting leadership of national governments, I think what you're going to see in the context of Somalia is that many of the ministers and people in government come from the diaspora. And that helps because they understand civil society better, they understand the NGO dynamics better, and can help facilitate that dialogue between local and international actors pretty well. And you see actually with some incidents happening and some challenges that you have 3-way conversations between civil society, donors, and the government on some of these issues.
Thanks very much, Abdurrahman. Mo.
Thank you. But just to tie a few things together, General Romeo's question and David Jones's question and Sorcha's as well on the implications on national actors. Well, what happened in the Philippines between Yolanda and Hagupit, for example, we're beginning to see more of that. So the reaction of the Nepalese government after the earthquake and their request for aid agencies to move, the statements that came out of Vanuatu. So as more countries move up from low to middle income, for example, this is going to be repeated. What it actually brings into question is how does the international system need to change, and what do we do in between crises or in between level 3, for example? So you can't build a national capacity while a response operation is happening. So David's question on the ramifications of that business model, well, not just the business model, but what do we invest in before we get to the next big one? The sort of repeated assumption that you cannot rely on the state and you have to work around the state when you have a level 3 is justified as long as we continue to respond to events but not forget about them, but have other priorities. Wow. So going back to the issue of changing the investment model that we have and building the capacity of the national system. But again, that's also highly contextual, because if you compare Latin America, for example, which is not mentioned a lot, and how much the national government has a capacity, and some of them, not all of them, to countries in South Asia. Yeah, so that model needs to be adapted regionally as well. It is central to the World Humanitarian Summit. National governments sitting on international decision-making forums, changing sort of modes and modalities of engagement between donors and national governments on a bilateral level, but also to understand the reality of those national governments. It's one of the questions that came out in the launch of the World Disasters Report in Geneva last week from Latin American governments, is that they have as much problems reconfiguring their models in dealing with local actors, right? In sort of grassroots level, and they need sort of more help in addressing that. It doesn't help them being bypassed all the time when a crisis happens. It lowers their capacity and it decreases their legitimacy.
Thank you very much, Mo. We're nearing the end of our time now. And I wanted to thank all of you for coming and participating today. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I hope that you'll all read the report with great interest. I also wanted to say that there will be a video of this event available on the ODI website within a few days, so please encourage people you know weren't able to attend to watch it. And the report, as I mentioned earlier, is available on the IFRC website. I also wanted to ask you to join us next week here at ODI on the 14th of October, where we'll be launching, HPN will be launching the revised edition of Good Practice Review 9 on disaster risk reduction, which is by Dr. John Twigg. And it does have sections also that look at local response, so I think it ties in quite nicely with the report this year. And we'll be using Nepal as a live case study with a video linked to Kathmandu, so please do join us then. So thank you again to everyone in the room and also watching online, to our panelists for being with us here today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thank you very much.